Hello again, I'm Paula Gooder in conversation with Rowan Williams about his book Discovering Christianity. This time we're going to turn our attention to reason. We've been talking in the past 2 sessions about scripture and tradition, which holds together in various people's minds with the third idea of reason. But reason sounds to me kind of quite clunky and unattractive. Talk to us a little bit about why reason is important.
It's a sort of bloodless word in a way, isn't it? People think of the age of reason, which is usually the 18th century, and it's all a little bit prissy to people's eyes. So I often prefer to talk about reasoning, because we sort of know what reasoning is. We argue, we develop protocols and conventions for arguing. We decide what counts as a good argument and what counts as a bad argument. And in any particular context, we are doing that reasoning activity. So we're bound to be involved in that. But it goes a bit further than that as well, because the way we reason, the way we argue, will be very closely connected with what we're taking for granted in our cultural environment. What might have seemed like a good argument 100 years ago doesn't seem such a good argument now. So there's got to be, in thinking of reason, a little bit of cultural sensitivity. That doesn't mean that things that were true 100 years ago have stopped being true now, or the other way around. It does mean that how we think, how we construct an argument, how we pursue an argument, simply how we talk continuously and intelligently to one another will shift a bit as time goes on.
I think even that, though, I think is quite difficult for a number of people. We live in a context these days which is actually not, which is A, very argumentative, and B, not very good at argument in the good sense. And I wonder if you can help us kind of untangle a little bit about how you can move into understanding argument as something that takes you forward, something that allows you to change your mind. How can you kind of craft that for us?
In the pre-modern period, when people talked about reason, especially in the Middle Ages, they meant something that ultimately attuned you to the mind of God. So reason wasn't a kind of independent capacity for getting the right answer and doing mathematical calculations. Reason was something that produced harmony and that reflected harmony. So maybe we need to reset it a bit and think, our reasoning, our argument, is not for the sake of flexing our muscles as intellectual beings, but for improving our communication and even our trust. Back to the recurrent theme of building relationship. So what about thinking of reason as a means of building relationship? We have a good conversation, I think, when you and I broadly agree about the sort of language we're using, the sort of conversation we're having, what counts as a good move or a baffling move in that, what counts as a good argument and a bad argument. And then the conversation can advance, and it changes both of us, and we're both in a rather larger and more imaginatively satisfying place when we finish talking. Now, if you think of reason in those terms, having good conversations, enlarging one another in the presence of conversation, I think we've got a lot to say to a society which, as you just remarked, is both very argumentative and terrible at argument, where what matters is people's sense of their rightness and their passion to have that rightness affirmed and to be victorious over others. And that's not certainly what the pre-modern sense of reason is, which is deeply connected with how we build and sustain community.
And that makes me wonder, because here we are sitting having a great conversation, and we agree on so many things. In a way, we are ideal conversation partners. Imagine I was somebody who held diametrically opposite opinions to you. What happens in that context? And again, often in the life of Christian faith, we do have to sit and talk to people that it turns out we disagree almost entirely with.
That's right. And of course, in the modern church, we're dealing with very diverse human cultures, political cultures, social mores, because we're a multicultural, multinational, multilingual community across the globe. If you're going to be a global community, the one thing you can't do is speak global. There's no kind of Esperanto that'll get us out of this fix. So what do I do with people who come from a different cultural, linguistic background? I try to learn how their thinking and their speaking works. I listen. I try to find the level at which we are still appealing to the same things, even if we come to different conclusions. I try to see what kinds of conversation might come in at a bit of an angle to the expected standoff and say, well, maybe if we look at that. And I'm sure they're doing the same with me if they want the conversation to continue. So a lot of listening is important. A willingness not instantly to say, my job here is to show that I'm right. And it's an image that comes back a lot to me, and I think it matters very deeply. Approaching the other with the expectation that I will be nourished and enlarged by this encounter. A Polish philosopher I very much admire said some years ago that in any good dialogue, what you recognize is that the other has something important to give you. So, although that may sound like a bit of aspirational liberal waffle, I think there really is something to it. And it's hard work. It's not just waffle. It's hard work to approach another with whom you disagree and say, there's something there I need. And it's equally hard for them. But that's how I think we move forward a bit.
So we've been thinking so far about conversation with two people. There's also that element, isn't there, of a conversation with yourself. Okay. And one of the images that you use in your book is also one of my favourite, of Karl Barth's idea that we read with the scripture in one hand and a newspaper in another. And it feels as though, in a way, what he's doing is setting up a kind of inner conversation there. Why do you think that's so important?
I wanted to mention one particular case from the 20th century because it's such a dramatic one. Karl Barth, who loses his job because of his opposition to the Nazis, basically, in the 1930s. Now, he's by no means an infallible or flawless theologian or person, but he has an absolute commitment to keeping the events of the day, the crises and the questions of the day, in living conversation with the Bible. For him, believing in the authority of the Bible is believing there is something there which has a transforming light to throw on the conventions, the controversies, the dead ends of the society he's in. He happens to be living at a time of colossal moral crisis, of building increasing atrocity behind the scenes and becoming less and less behind the scenes as the 1930s go on. A critical moment when the church is being really pressed to go along with what a very sinister state apparatus is telling us. And Barth is making a bid for the freedom of the Bible to speak into that and say, we're not accepting the premises of that. We have something to say that's different. And we have a space that we have to be faithful to here. So that holding of the Bible and the newspaper together, that's a very dramatic example, but for all of us there is some element of that in how we relate. We've spoken about the importance of being sensitive to different cultures and all the rest of it. Absolutely yes. But what that does not mean is that the Christian church simply gives in to a cultural habit or a cultural pattern and says, well, that's how it is. We just go along with it. You always have to have that argument and the conversation between the scripture and the present moment. And sometimes, in crude terms, sometimes that comes out liberal and sometimes it comes out conservative. But the important thing is getting that conversation going.
Rowan, thank you. We've been reflecting this time on reason. Join us for our final session when we draw all the strands together and think about why all of this matters.